Okay, Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon was running out of money for all. If you know anything about French history, Napoleon engaged in a whole lot of wars. The wars were expensive. So Napoleon was willing to sell land west of the Mississippi River to the United States. It has been said that Napoleon got his brothers around him, and he was sitting in his bathtub when he signed the order. Whatever, he sold the land that's called Louisiana Purchase. Now, it wasn't just Louisiana. Today, Louisiana is just one small state in this bottom of the very south of Mississippi, where the Mississippi pours into the Gulf. Louisiana is a small state today, but in those days, it consisted of those states west of the Mississippi, including Louisiana, Oklahoma, a part of Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, and then all the way to Oregon. Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana. In other words, a whole big chunk of territory that made up the purchase. Napoleon sold the United States. Jefferson worried that it was not constitutional. He said, well, am I allowed to do this by Constitution? Now,
Spell that wrong.
what's that? L-O-U-I. What's that? L-O-U. Oh, yeah, thank you. L-O-U-I-S-I-A-N-A, Louisiana. Now, he was asked himself, does the Constitution allow this? Finally, though, there was a clause in the Constitution that said that any law, basically it says any law that is necessary for the government, it's called the Elastic Clause, gave him the power to do this. Now, Thomas Jefferson was an enigma. As a young man, he was a revolutionary. Let's get rid of the King of England. As an old man, he became king himself, actually president. And he insisted that his laws had to be obeyed, and he insisted on a strict interpretation of the law. But, basically he did an about-face, which is not unheard of for a man to do. They say if you're not liberal when you're young, you have no heart. If you're not conservative when you're old, you have no mind. That's a saying that's going around. But anyway, Thomas Jefferson became highly conservative in his old age. He was quite liberal in his young. Now, when he got to purchase, he sent two men, Lewis and Clark, all right. About the time you young people, this might help remember, about the time you young people, huh? Yeah. About the time you young people were being born, there was a movie that came out called Lois and Clark. Not about these men. Lois and Clark, by the way, was about Lois Lane and Clark Kent. But anyway, that's, yeah, Lois Lane. Anyway, this is Lewis and Clark now. Somewhat different, yeah. Anyway, Lewis and Clark, and it's, oh yeah, there's an and here. Lewis and Clark, two men out west to explore. The Spanish got wind of it, and they sent an army to try to capture Lewis and Clark and Lewis and Clark, and they couldn't find them. I mean, all this territory was huge. But they took along an Indian named Sacagawea. Sacagawea, because they had an Indian along, that helped them live at peace with the Indians while they were exploring. But they got all the way to the Columbia River, and then they got all the way to the Pacific Ocean, went down the river. And this way was the beginning of the Oregon Trail that was to come a little bit later. But they explored, and they wrote what they saw. They called the flora and fauna. What kind of animals did you see? What kind of plants did you see? And they saw moose, among others, and elk, and various kinds of buffalo, quite a bit of stuff. And of course, they crossed the Rocky Mountains. The land just west of Mississippi is fairly flat. Then you come to the foothills and then the mountains. They crossed the mountains. They were gone a good while. Then they came back and reported what they'd seen. Well, this was done in 1803. In 1903, we had a celebration to commemorate the 200th anniversary of it, and some people said the Lewis and Clark expedition was not as important at that time as it became later. But whatever, every history book I've seen mentions it, so we'll mention it also.
How did they survive that like whole journey? Because like you can't carry enough food for that long. And
No, they couldn't. What they did, partly they traded in, but also they hunted. They hunted, they fished, and they lived on berries. They found berries. They lived on roots. They learned what kind mushrooms, anything they could find along the way. But yeah, it's a good point. But they managed. Again, these men, and at that time, they lived different from what we do today. In those days, even an American farmer would go out in this place and try to find mushrooms and berries. Blackberries will start growing up. The blackberries are spread by bird droppings. They're found any place where they allow weeds to grow up. They're not found in people's yards because the lawnmower blade takes care of them rather quickly. But blackberries will grow up if you just let your grass alone. After a while, you'll see blackberries and raspberries growing in. Or you might, put it that way. But they lived on things like that. And they hunted, they traded with the Indians. Again, it helped that they had an Indian guide with them. Sacagawea. Again, Sacagawea was pregnant at the start of the trip. Her baby was born during a trip, and when the Indians saw her and her baby, they left them alone. They reached the Pacific Ocean November 1805. Again, the whole trip took about 4 years, and then they came back. All right. While all this was going on, things were still going on in Europe. Oh yeah, in 1804, Thomas Jefferson was reelected. Thomas Jefferson, but George Washington, the first president, he was reelected. John Adams only served 1 term. Thomas Jefferson served 2 terms. He was elected in 1804, but he had to deal with the issue of the war between France and England. France and England were at each other's throats, and here was the thing: England had been our enemy, and France had been our friend during our revolution. But a lot of Americans felt like, hey, conditions aren't the same now. We're not obligated to side with French now. But then Napoleon took office, and Napoleon was friendly and nice, and Napoleon gave us $15 million. Pardon me. Napoleon gave us all this territory for $15 million. Pardon me. Gave us all this land cheap. We were mostly friendly with Napoleon. The English became upset at us, and they started taking our seamen on the high seas. It's called impressment. They would stop an American ship, and they'd look around the ship and say, "You are an English deserter. You are," whether he was or not. And then they'd say, "You're going to have to serve in the English Navy whether you want to or not." Well, some of the men they took were known to be American citizens. They'd been born in the colonies, and anyway, they were impressing our seamen. This was to lead to another war with Great Britain. Now, the War of 1812 would probably have been averted if there had been radio, if there had been television, because the British government had finally agreed to stop impressing our seamen. But several things. Number one, the British sea captains did not heard about the order. Number one, and number two, nobody in America had heard about the order either. But the British government in London decided, we're not going to impress any more American seamen. Never mind, the Americans did not know that. So in 1812, we declared war on Great Britain again. This was a declared war. The war lasted 2.5 years. The worst part of the war for the Americans was when the British burned our White House. Actually, before that, it was called the President's Mansion. But President Madison was sitting in the White House about to sit to a meal, and all of a sudden they got word the British were coming into Washington. The British came in, the Madisons deserted, and James Madison then found some troops, and he became the only president in history to actually take personal command of a contingent of troops while president. The president has always been head of the army, but he's never actually led the army on the field. At least not while president. No president ever has, except for Madison. Madison tried to defend the city of Washington. Now, but the British took it. It was humiliating for the Americans. They burned the president's mansion, but not to the ground. After the war, they painted over the burn, and they called it the White House. It's been called the White House ever since. Anyway, Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, to her credit, she took down the portrait of George Washington that was hanging in the White House and saved it. Otherwise, it would have been burned. But we still have that portrait today. In fact, today, if you go to the White House, there's a picture of all the presidents. The first ones were painted, then some of them were photographed, and the last ones have been taken with digital photography. But the portraits of all the presidents are hanging in the White House today. Now, then the British Army went from Washington to Baltimore, 40 miles away, and they went to Fort McHenry. At Fort McHenry, they saw a man named Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott, who was an attorney just going about business, and they said, Francis Scott Key, no, they couldn't let him go loose. Yeah, they couldn't let him go loose because he'd seen the army, so they took him on board a British ship. But they treated him kindly. Yes, he was an American, but he was not bearing up arms against the British. They put him on board a British ship, and they allowed him to go up and down the decks of that British ship he was on. Well, down below decks were some American prisoners of war. Well, Francis Scott Key watched the shelling of Fort McHenry. The shelling began just before the sun went down, and he saw the big flag flying on top of the staff. Now, I've seen that flag. I mean, it's almost the size of this classroom wall, and it has a few holes in it that were made. Anyway, he saw the flag, and throughout the night he could see the flag. Anybody know how? It was a dark night, no moon. By the rockets' red glare, by the bombs bursting in air. I had to be right. How did the rockets red glare? Start out. So what he'd do is every time a rocket went off, he'd say the flag. So he'd go down below, the men below, the flag is still there. Go back up, maybe a bomb next would be fired into the air. When the bomb exploded, flag is there. Go down below, our flag is still there. Well, 2 hours before dawn, the British stopped shelling. The British had decided we can't take Fort McHenry like we took Washington. So the British were going to sail on to New Orleans. But they didn't tell Francis Scott Key that. So Francis Scott Key had told them, the shelling has stopped, but I can't see the flag, it's too dark. But if any of you have ever been up at the dawn very early, before the sun comes up, the sun will light up the upper atmosphere. And by the dawn's early light, Francis Scott Key could see the flag. The flag is still there. Francis Scott Key was so inspired by this that he wrote a poem about it. The poem was made into a song. The song eventually became our national anthem. By the rockets radio. Can you see by the dawn's early light what we had seen at the twilight's last gleaming? The stars and stripes. Anyway, he said, throughout the night, by the rocket's red glare, by the bomb bursting there, gave proof tonight our flag was still there. By the dawn's early light, the flag was still there. Now, it has been said that the song that he wrote, which became our national anthem, was given to the tune of a beer song. As far as music goes, it's not the most pleasant song you can hear, and not the easiest song there is to sing, but nevertheless, the words are inspiring, to say the least, the words. Now, I wanted to say that the words play ball are not part of the text. They represent a later addition to the original text. Anyway, so much for that. But anyway, Francis Scott Key wrote it. The song became our national anthem. Now, this same British Army that had burned down Washington and burned part of Washington, that could not take Fort McHenry, went to New Orleans. At New Orleans, they met a man named Jackson. And Jackson only had 4,000 men against the British 9,000. But Jackson's men hid behind cotton bales. The British Army marched European style, straight and tall, 9,000 strong. Jackson said, make every shot count. Don't fire till you can see them clearly. The British Army marched on, and Jackson's men fired one volley, bang, right into the British Army. A bunch of British soldiers dropped dead. The British kept on coming. Jackson's men reloaded and fired again, bang. After the second shot, the British turned and started running pell-mell. 2 of their generals were killed. The British kept running and kept running, not knowing that they greatly outnumbered the Americans. This was called the Battle of New Orleans. It was a strange battle, folk, in that it was fought in January 1815. But unknown to them, in December 1814, the British government had signed a treaty and America to end the war. Again, no news, no telephones, no telegraph, no radios, no television, no internet. Nobody knew the war was actually over. But it gave Americans a whole lot of pride. Now, after the humiliation of having had their capital burned, another thing that gave America a whole lot of pride was a ship, the USS Constitution. The Constitution did a lot to, well, it destroyed two British ships, the Guerre and the Java. Two ships, that some of the best ships the British had. Again, the Americans had built their ships after the British had built theirs, and a lot of times when you build something new, you can build it better. The Constitution was a better constructed ship than anything the British had. Anyway, the War of 1812, when it ended, neither side had won or lost territory. And the war, again, could have been averted if James Madison had done what John Adams did and negotiated with the British one more time. He'd have found out that the British had agreed to stop impressing seamen. Another issue, too, the British were told by the Treaty of Paris in 1783 they were supposed to leave the territory of the Northwest. A lot of them still stayed there, and a lot of the British did encourage the Indians to fight against the United States. This was still going on up to 1812. After 1812, the British realized we might as well give up. We can't conquer our colonies back. There are now too many of them. So they at least gave up on that idea, and eventually Great Britain and the United States made peace. Shortly afterwards, Napoleon met the British at the Battle of Waterloo, and maybe you know the results. Napoleon lost. There was a song about Waterloo some years back. But, well, basically what happened at Waterloo, it was called the best laid plans of mice and men. One of his generals didn't show up. The general was doing what he was supposed to do. The general was going after the Prussian general, and the Prussian general had already joined the British general. So Napoleon had to fight the Prussians and the British while one of his generals was going out on a wild goose chase. And one of Napoleon's generals, I say, didn't show up, and he could hear the sound of the battle off to his left, but he looked at my orders tell me I'm to do such and such. Sometimes, folk, it's wise to break the orders. If General Booker had only done what was logical, we could hear the sound of the firing off to his left. His officers urged him, you need to go join the battle. He didn't. If he'd have shown up at the last minute, he might have turned the tide of the battle. But Napoleon lost. Napoleon was sent all the way to the South Pacific in exile. And he died in exile. And the sun had set on another would-be world conqueror. Now, George Washington had a wife, and she would entertain the guest. John Adams, of course, had a wife, and she would entertain the guest. Thomas Jefferson, during the 8 years he was president, did not have a wife as such. His wife had long died. And he refused to have anything at all to do with Washington women. So during that time, there wasn't that much social life that went on in Washington. That changed with Dolly Madison. Yeah.
Is that the same?
What's that?
Is that the one that's still?
Well, okay, Thomas Jefferson's mistress was not his wife.
Oh.
He had a wife one time, but she died around 1780, 1781 or two, thereabouts. And this was 18...
So his social life took a swing. He just started.
In other words, okay, if you know anything at all, the city of Washington has a whole lot of high society social life. And the president's wife is expected to lead. And like the vice president's wife is expected to lead the senator's wives.
Right.
And so on and so forth. Well, in the case of Thomas Jefferson, he had no wife. And during his time, the parties did not go on. The high society Washington life did not go on. Dolly Madison brought all that back, much more so than George Washington and John Adams had. She was the high society woman. Again, as First Lady, she served as First Lady for 8 years, and she influenced our first 8 presidents all the way from Washington to Polk. But she was the leader of the city of Washington during the entire time that she was alive, all the way up to President Polk. She did a lot, in fact, to modernize the Polk family, because they were from Tennessee and backward country like, and she brought them up to the big city. Anyway, Washington political life had a lot to do with the women, which we talked about when Jackson becomes president also, because in Jackson's day there was a woman that the other women did not like, and Jackson's own wife had been slandered, and Jackson's wife was deceased, so Jackson sided with a wife who was not liked. And this led to a big split in Jackson's party. So in other words, this is important. But in the case of Dolly Madison, they call it social politics. These wives did a lot to influence what went on in Washington. They influenced behind the scene. They did it by persuasion, not so much by coercion, because officially they didn't even have the right to vote. And yet they would meet with their husbands at home, and their husband would talk politics with them. And again, Dolly Madison was the leader. We get back to Tecumseh again. Tecumseh fought against William Henry Harrison, who later became president himself. Tecumseh, in his fight with Harrison, lost his fight with Harrison, as did most of the Indians. And the Indians were forced into poverty, or forced to take up their old ways. And a lot of them left and went farther west in the west of the Mississippi. The battle that Harrison won was the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison became one of America's heroes, and William Henry Harrison later became President of the United States. Another one of our generals. We've had several generals who became president, among them Washington, Harrison, Taylor, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, 3 generals in a row, and finally Eisenhower. Eisenhower is president. So we had several generals. Now, generally, generals have not made the best of presidents. But that's speaking in generality. Sorry. All right, anyway, so much for that.
No puns.
Anyway, Tecumseh won the Battle of Tippecanoe. Your book mentions how that the American people were moving westward, and this trend was continued for 100 years. In 1810, the census counted 230,000, don't write these down, but Americans in Ohio. Another 40,000 lived in Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan, while the Indians only had 70,000 people living in all this area, 70,000 people to oppose 270,000 whites. Again, the reason why the white population, keep in mind, the American Indian women only averaged about 1 or 2 babies per woman. The American Indians lived an average of 18 years. The Indian population kept declining, while the average white woman was having 6 to 10 babies per woman, and also the whites were getting immigrants moving from overseas. So folk picked the winner. Not to mention the whites had better technology and better organization. I mean, you don't think of Indians as being soldiers. The Indians were braves, they were warriors, but they did not fight as a team. A soldier fights as a team. You don't fight one of them without fighting them all. The Indians would pick on someone who looks like he's my size, I'll take him on. If they could dispatch him, then they go to the next, look around, who's the next man who doesn't look like he's one of mine? Oh, maybe I'll take him on. If a man who was bigger than them came out, they could turn around and run. That was the Indians' way of fighting, and it did not do against an army of professional trained soldiers. All right. Before the War of 1812, a new group of people came on the scene called the War Hawks. They favored going to war. Now, the War of 1812, unlike our other declared wars, it had the highest percentage of Congress in both houses against it. But one of the main men in the War Hawks is a man we'll hear about in the next few weeks, Henry Clay. Henry Clay started his career as a war hawk. He was from the West. He was a man from Kentucky. And in fact, his Kentucky home is still a national shrine. There, Henry Clay, so Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. But anyway, and also, I was born in Kentucky. West Liberty for me. In 2014, I finally went back to West Liberty, and I told my wife, this is where I was born. And I doubt that my dad would recognize it. The city was hit by a tornado some years before, and it's pretty well recovered from it now. But the tornado destroyed a lot of downtown. If you've never heard of it, don't worry about it. But it's there, still on the map. West Liberty is located in the eastern foothills of Kentucky. As the mountains are coming to an end, that's why they call it the foothills. All right.
Now, this Henry Clay, well, where is he exactly?
Henry Clay. Now, actually, in the case of Henry Clay, if you look him up, he figures in a lot. But the Warhawks, right here on page 245, at the bottom of the page, they start with Henry Clay. If you look him up in the index, you're going to find lots and lots of pages that have his name on them. He was very prominent. He ran for president, in fact, 3 times and lost all 3. One of the men who came close to being president but never got to be. Ran over and over again, like William Jennings Bryan, who came later. All right. Calhoun was also there, and you're going to hear about him. John C. Calhoun was from South Carolina. Clay and Calhoun were both in the Congress at that time, in 1811. Now, in the War of 1812, like the Revolutionary War, the United States sent an army to Canada to conquer Canada. And I've got to say this, folk, the British Army whipped us both times. I'm not going to say the Canadians did it. The Canadians didn't. The Canadians fought really well in World War II. I mean, I will hand them that. But they didn't fight very much at this time. The Canadians never had a civil war. They never really got their independence from Great Britain. They're still part of it. But the British Army whipped us both times. Sad, because one of our older generals, an old man, met a British contingent, and he had quite a bit more men than the British had, but he surrendered without a fight. And some of the men actually broke down and cried when they couldn't fight. The general was court-martialed, but President Madison pardoned him because of his gray hairs. He was old, and today the Army has a mandatory retirement age and I'm already past that retirement age, which 60 years old. There are a few cases where they waiver it, but you have to retire at a certain time. All right, anyway. Battle of New Orleans, that's in your book on page 248. Now, the treaty that ended the war was the Treaty of Ghent. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask on the test. Treaty of G-H-E-N-T. Ended the War of 1812. It was signed in December 1814, and again, Andrew Jackson don't know about it. And the Battle of New Orleans occurred in January, but believe me, it was not cold when Andrew Jackson clobbered the British in New Orleans. It was a nice, warm, pleasant, spring-like day. Again, the weather in New Orleans, they seldom, if ever, have any snow, and rarely have any frost and ice. They do on occasion now. All right. Because the Federalists had opposed the war, the Federalists were looked on as being traitors, and the Federalist Party went out of existence. Never again did they put up a candidate for president.
For the War of 1812?
After the War of 1812, yeah, they were considered traitors. And for all practical purposes, they were dead. All right. Your book then goes on to talk about the women, how that women's status did not change much after the War of 1812, but women slowly and gradually got more and more freedom. But one change that did come about shortly after the War of 1812 was divorce became legal. Before this time, divorce was either illegal or very rare, but became legal, and it also became legal for wives to divorce their husbands, as well as husbands to divorce their wives. And a few women began to speak in public, and a few women began to actually preach, take on as a preacher. Now, one of the more famous was a woman named Jemima Wilkinson. I'm not going to write that name down, but she might have done a lot for the cause of women ministers, except that she looked like and dressed like a man. She dressed in man's clothing.